million people has just 3,842 confirmed cases. If that number seems low, that's because it is.
Indonesia spent a long time denying it had COVID-19 infections. When it finally admitted it in March, it acknowledged that it had been keeping the truth from the public to avoid panic.
Only 73 out of every 1 million people have been tested in Indonesia, one of the lowest rates in the world. One study estimates as few as 2% of Indonesia's total coronavirus infections have been reported. It's the prelude to a crisis Indonesia's health system simply can't handle. The country has just 4 doctors and 12 hospital beds per 10,000 people, and fewer than 3 intensive care beds per 100,000 people.
There's also an extreme shortage of ventilators and of protective equipment for health workers. Some have been told they just have to turn up in raincoats, and that's why around 10% of deaths so far have been healthcare workers.
But the most telling numbers might come from the country's coffin makers.
Usually we sell 5 to 7 coffins a day, but right now it is around 20 to 30 coffins a day.
There are still around 3,000 Australian tourists in Indonesia and about 7,000 permanent residents. DFAT says if you can book a commercial flight home, do so as soon as possible, or else make plans for an extended stay. And they're not kidding. One forecast shows the health risk in Indonesia not peaking until sometime in late September.
Every year, 1.2 million Australians have travelled to Bali for their annual holiday. Once this is over in Australia and the borders are open, it's likely that the problems will be continuing in Indonesia for some time. Australians will have to think very carefully about where they go for their next annual holiday.
This is absolutely terrifying stuff, and the unknown is what's so scary. To have only 73 out of every million people tested, that's awful.
Extraordinary. And at the moment, only 3 ICU beds per 100,000 citizens. And we're talking about the 4th most populated country in the world. And, Lisa, it's right on our doorstep as well, you know.
And you think of Bali, it will be decimated because the Australian tourist dollar is what they all rely on. And under normal circumstances, when you think about the tsunami back in 2004, Australia was first up with so much help. But we're dealing with our own situation now. So our help just isn't going to be there in the way that we normally would want to perform.
Yeah, that hyper-nationalism, you know, it's not through a lack of desire to help, but countries are looking after themselves like never before.
Guys, I think this brings up an interesting issue, which is people have often said about COVID-19 that it doesn't discriminate, that it's the great equaliser, the great leveller, which is an absolute crock. It is going to hit disadvantaged people so much harder than it is going to hit the rest of the population. So anytime you hear some of that rhetoric about, oh, this is the great equaliser and it doesn't discriminate, that's just not true. And spare a thought for those who are already doing it tough. It's going to be so much tougher for them.
That's such a good point, because whether it's the elderly, people with chronic conditions, or, as you say, Tommy, nations that don't have the resources that wealthy nations do.
Very.